Dear reader, ever since I was young, I've wondered about cruelty and what makes it so easy for some to be so cruel to others. Sometimes the kind of cruelty that I've witnessed when I was young has been people who viewed themselves as better by the sheer fact of some kind of label they affix to themselves and the label that they then apply to those on the outside. And it's kind of this unfortunate outline that gets placed around themselves versus the others that they're meeting with, this kind of borderline between what makes them valuable and what makes the other less so. And it's this mental borderline that we create for ourselves against others that has become something I've always been curious about. I had the both good and misfortune of living across class lines as I was growing up, going from poverty to upper middle class, and that created a sense of the different kinds of communities and the kinds of mindsets that would become associated with being in that class, and the fixations and also insecurities that would develop out of that mindset. I bring that up because I want to talk about a book that I recently finished. It's called A People's Tragedy by Orlando Fikes. And it's about the Russian Revolution. I've been, for a couple of years now, just trying to read books about kinds of violence. And the sorts of violence that comes up very often is revolutionary violence, political violence, often ideologically tinged violence, where your belief suddenly becomes the motivation for starkly disruptive action. My expectation going into this particular book was that I was going to learn about the Russian Revolution in a strictly narrative sense. I would get the full plot outline of what happened during the Russian Revolution, the major figures that we all know about, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and so on. And it would just give me that general build-up to what came after with the Soviet Union. What surprised me immediately as I was reading through the opening of the book is how much time it spends, how much text it spends, considering the social dynamics going on in Russia at the time. The build-up to World War I, the Tsarist regime and its adherence to what had come before, and this kind of insecure power that it was constantly building up and trying to maintain. And then the ways in which that view, that insecure view from the Tsarist regime led to not really listening to the needs of those further down. This hierarchy of difference that was being built up in the last days of the Romanovs. And this book surprised me again and again by really trying to think about what it was like to be among the peasantry, to be among the lower classes, to be among the workers, to be among the bureaucrats, to be among those both in the very center of the social hierarchy and those on the outskirts of it. And to me, it ended up being a fascinating overview of the ways in which we could really not understand each other and the ways in which we could not quite understand ourselves. The Tsar had this view of himself as a kind of father over the land, as being some overlord above it, and the entirety of Russia being within his purview of control. And the peasantry had the exact opposite view of self, of a wholly local control, with the work that you put into the land being the very merit that determines your ownership of that land and your use of the land going forward. And this constant ebb and flow of communal relationship and ownership within the peasantry. And the ways that the people within the cities could speak so confidently about what the peasants were going through and yet have no idea what it was like to be them. And they would use the image of the peasantry in order to bolster some predetermined logic of how history should be, of how Russia should evolve and change, and the ways in which that information would be so filtered by what we desire it to be as opposed to what it in fact is. And that is precisely the thing that I didn't fully expect from this book. It did not end up being a narrative history in the traditional literary sense of striving to be like a structured story. It ended up being so much more about a question of how can we not understand ourselves? How can we not understand those who live near us or in the same country as us, who have so many of the same desires as us, and yet we can see in them something far away and distant and disturbed and off? Or we can see in them an ideal to then lift up and use as a justification for whatever it is that we want. And all of this is building up to this revolution that happens, where you have in the Russian Revolution ideological combat, essentially, over what does it mean to revolutionize this country? What does it mean to have freedom, right? It becomes an argument over definitions. And in the case of those who win out with the Bolsheviks, it becomes an argument of freedom is not for the individual, but for the entirety of the class. Your class identity and label becomes what matters. And it's this choice of which label you're going to have matter that becomes the choice that defines the entirety of everything that follows. It becomes about, once you have these labels, it becomes both an enclosing structure that keeps you in line and allows for any dissent to immediately be shut out as counter-revolutionary. But it also allows for a closing off of new information, because once you attach yourself to an identity, well, the need for discovery becomes superfluous. So much of desire for discovery does kind of run on the idea that there is something to discover. And when you run out of the motivation to discover yourself, well, then the motivation to discover much of the rest of the world also goes with it. In so many ways, this book accomplishes exactly what it states in the title. It says that it's a people's tragedy, and by the end of the book, it felt like a genuine tragedy. It felt like we had a mix of so many different points of view and so many desires about what the world can be and what we can do understandably to take down a czarist regime that was far too autocratic and simplistic and bogged down in old systems and ways of doing things. And then the book really emphasized how that desire for good and for a kind of escape from that tyranny does not allow you to simply escape the bad habits of humanity, the ways that us in our nature can be so imposing on each other. The very thing that made the czarist regime so destructive can be in all of us given the right circumstances. And within an ideological realm, we can trap ourselves and feel as if we somehow found enough for us to feel justified and righteous. And perhaps it's that sense of self-righteousness that I found so compelling in the book. When it was going through these different changes throughout the Russian Revolution, it felt like I was getting a glimpse of some of the ways in which we can be so harmful while we consider ourselves being truly right. And it is perhaps those who feel most right that are the most worrying of all. And this book truly accomplishes that goal of making it clear the hurt that we can give to others and perhaps in the long term to ourselves over a distant ideal.